Sometimes when you go out fishing, you're beaten before you started because of the way your reel was spooled up. Now, there is a correct way and an incorrect way to spool up a fishing reel, and it varies depending on what sort of line you're using, and it often starts with the sort of line you actually choose, the weight of line or the thickness of line. Now, I've got a surf casting reel here that is running a bit low on line, so immediately that reduces my casting distance, so it's time for a respool. So I'm going to show you how to respool a line with monofilament line as opposed to braid line, because there are two different things that you do, and it's very, very important that you pay attention to what sort of line you're using as your main line. Now, the first thing you've got to do is actually take your line off, and this little gizmo here is probably the most amazing line tool I've ever seen. What you do is you put your line through this eye here, push a button, and it whips off your line. And it saves a heap of time when you're getting off your line. This is an amazing tool, works really well with mono, doesn't work so well with thin braid, but if you want to get your line off your spool in a hurry, it's the only way to go. It's very, very cool. And remember to always get rid of your old nylon carefully. You don't want birds and things like that getting tangled up on it. So take all your nylon off once it's, if your load's too low, take it all off, and then I'll show you what we do next. So once you've removed all your line, don't rush into putting your fresh line on. First of all, check your reel specifications, because it will actually tell you how much line you need. So get a spool that's obviously got enough. Many spools will fill your reel twice, so make sure you've got the right amount. Also, they have recommended breaking strains. So if it says, you know, recommended for 200 meters of 20-pound line, obviously you need at least 200 meters of 20-pound line. So get that when you buy it. Your choice of line, there's so many lines, you've got to choose one that suits your style of fishing. You know the environment that you're fishing in, whether it's rocky or sandy, or you want a thin line or a thick line. That's pretty much personal taste. But before you put your line on, make sure you give your spool a spray and a wipe with some inox. Now, the reason you do this is because it stops corrosion, because the bottom of the spool very rarely sees daylight, but it sees lots of salt water. So if you give it a spray with inox, give it a double spray, and that will give it a nice coating so it won't corrode. Okay, and that's a very good tip. Now, the next thing is, when you're fishing with monofilament line, you should always put some backing under your spool. Now, the reason you do this is because, I'll give you a little demonstration with a little bit of mono here. You imagine the line wrapping around your finger and see how it gets more and more tension? Well, that applies tension to your spool as well, which can actually cause enough pressure to break it. A full load on a big game reel can actually exert about a ton of pressure. So the reason you put backing on is to absorb all that pressure from monofilament line. And what you should use is some non-stretch cord, or another really handy thing, if you get some of that really soft plumber's tape, put a couple of layers of that around your spool, and that will absorb all the pressure from the monofilament line, and it will help it bed in properly. So I've got some cord line here, so I'm going to put some cord backing on before I spool up with mono. A good tip to remember when you're spooling up reels is always open your bail before you put the line on, otherwise you can't wind it. If you do forget, what you have to do is take the spool off and open the bail and put it back on. That way your line will wind on. Now, spooling up can be a two-person operation. What you need to do is have one person that's winding the line and the other person needs to hold the spool. So what we like to do is get a big solid screwdriver, pop it through the spool, and get a glove or a cloth for the opposite person to hold, because it's very important that the line goes onto your spool under pressure with some tension. Otherwise it's too loose on the spool and the line can bite in and cause break-offs, and you don't actually fit enough on your reel either. So it's got to go on under tension with quite a bit of pressure. So someone needs to hold this quite firmly while you're winding it on. So I'll get my assistant to hold it while I spool up. So when you start to wind, make sure your drag's set, because you don't want it too loose. And then you start slowly winding it on, building up the layers. And how you get these first layers on is very important, because if you get any bumps or lumps there, it will be exaggerated throughout the whole spooling up process. And make sure your assistant puts plenty of tension on the line so that it goes on nice and tight with a bit of stretch. And that backing will absorb that stretch and your spool will bed in nicely and you'll have it really nicely layered. You don't need to wind fast, and you just need to make sure you've got good tension on the line. So I've got my reel beautifully filled up Don't be tempted to scrimp and underspool it, or don't be tempted to overspool it. If you underspool it, it reduces your casting distance, and also you could get spooled if you run out of line. And if you overfill it, line tends to fly off and tangle. Now that was with mono. With braid line, it's slightly different because braid line doesn't stretch. When you tie braid, if you tie it directly to the arbor of your reel, which is the part where you tie the line on, if it isn't locked in or it doesn't have a little pin to lock it in, the whole load of line can rotate. So what you need to do is, I usually tie on about 4 or 5 layers of monofilament trace, and then I tie my braid to that, because that allows the monofilament to stretch, and then the braid will bed into that and it won't be able to slide around the whole spool. So that's the difference. With braid, put mono underneath. With mono, put some non-stretch underneath. Slightly back to front, but I tell you what, you'll get a beautiful load of line. And the last tip, on boat reels, always cross-wind your line. Don't lie the layers next to each other, otherwise they'll bite in. And then you'll be safe for fishing, and it's beautiful going out with a fresh load of line and catching a good fish.